it is upon the souls who are now also veiled behind human bodies, and they don't know who is their enemy from the human beings and who is their friend or their ally. And there's all these different voices that are pulling them in different directions. So the test is that in the midst of all these voices, in the midst of this great test, in the midst of being veiled, that they recognize the spirit or the soul of God. My dear brother Juraj.
Walaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, Father.
We're good to have you here.
Thank you. Good to be here.
So today we want to talk about an important topic. We've mentioned bits and pieces of it before, but I think it will be nice to delve into it in a deeper way. We'll cover a little bit about what we mentioned before, but mention a whole lot of new things because it's a really important topic and it has to do with the soul. Okay? So basically, since the very beginning of mankind's existence, mankind began to ponder, wonder, seek information concerning the soul. And the reason why is because mankind grew afraid of death. Okay? They realized that death had come into this world. They witnessed the human beings being born, animals being born, living their life, and then at some point in time they ceased to exist. They would fall into a sleep and never wake up from it, right? Or they would be slaughtered and killed, and then that body would never move anymore. That personality would never speak anymore. And they thought that might be the end of their existence. But there were prophets and messengers that came to humanity to inform them of the opposite. They told them that it is important for them to do good deeds because this is not the end. There is a life that exists beyond this physical life that we're in. Once we die, this does not mean that there is nothing else. There actually is an aspect of us who will move on and live on. And the people, they had a hard time believing in this in the beginning or understanding this concept, this notion that there's this invisible aspect of our own selves that would live on in another world after our physical bodies cease to exist. And so one narration from the Ahlul Bayt alayhim salam explains actually how one prophet succeeded in convincing his people at the very beginning. And the narration states that at one point in mankind's history, dreams didn't exist. Okay? And the prophet wanted to prove to his people the existence of an afterlife. And so, because the people were belying him, he prayed to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to give them a sign. And so God inspired his prophet and told him to tell his people that that night they will get their sign once they fall asleep. And so he informed them and they fell asleep. And that night they all had dreams, all right? Beautiful, magnificent visions. Some of them saw themselves hunting, others saw themselves playing with their children, with their family. Others yet went on magnificent adventures during their dream. And so they all woke up amazed. And thus the prophet had confirmed to them this possibility of a world that could exist once a person lays their head down, to rest at night and goes to sleep. Right? That it is possible that a person experienced something else. And he explained to them that it was their soul that experienced these dreams while they were sleeping because their bodies laid restless, right? And they did not go to the places or experience the things that they did with their physical selves, but rather there was this other aspect to them, which was the soul, and it's the soul that lives on. And just as it managed to, experience these things after sleep, so would the soul experience worlds in the hereafter, after its death, right? And so that was the beginning. And after that, people sought to seek more and more answers concerning the soul. They wanted to know what it looks like. They came to conclusions. There's a lot of misconceptions that are out there. People assumed, for example, that the soul resembled the human body. Right, and that's why you have these movies or cartoons where when the ghost goes out of the soul goes out of the human being, that it looks identical to it. It's just kind of like a see-through version of him that really can't, move physical objects or as such, right?
Yes.
But in fact, in reality, the soul looks nothing like the body. Ahmed Hassan salam, he said that the difference between the soul and the body is like the difference between a human being and a cat. It looks completely different. It's an entire different being altogether. And it exists also in a different world, and that world we've been told about from the Ahl Bayt alayhim salam. Sometimes it's referenced as the Adam world, right, or the soul world, and it is a world that existed, that we were all a part of and still exists till today. A world where all of the souls were in when they were first created, before they came down into this physical reality or physical world. It's a world where those souls were tested, when they were first created. And there's different narrations from the Ahl Bayt alayhim salam that describe different tests that the souls had to go through. One particular test, was that God had set this gigantic fire in front of all of the souls, and he commanded the souls to jump into the fire. And some of the souls, they jumped into it without hesitation. And the very first soul to jump in obedience to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was the soul of Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa alayhi. And then after that were the souls of the prophets and the messengers, each jumping in, in accordance to their degree and closeness to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And actually this test is what kind of determined, the degrees and the abilities that those prophets and messengers had when they came into the earth and incarnated in human form. And then there was a group that hesitated, and that consisted of the souls of the vast majority of mankind, right? But some of them eventually jumped in, and those were the souls of the believers after witnessing the prophets and the messengers proceed before them. And others did not go in, and those were the souls of the disbelievers, and yet others were extremely stubborn and doubtful, and they belied altogether, and those were the souls of the tyrants. In another test that's mentioned that took place in the soul world was this test that the narration states Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala manifested his light to the souls in the Adam world, and they were all standing from behind a veil. And God said to them from behind the veil, "Am I not your Lord?" And Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam was the first soul that fell down in prostration, in confirmation of the fact that he recognized that this voice and this light that was from behind the veil that was speaking was God Almighty. And as such, like the first narration, all of the prophets and the messengers, they began to prostrate, all in accordance to their degree and level of recognition of God and knowing of God. And yet a group of people, they hesitated. And that all determined, who were the first and foremost of the prophets and the messengers, who were the believers, who were the non-believers, and who were the enemies of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So we have these narrations that speak of a world where we existed before we incarnated into this world. We had tests in that world, in that dimension. It's a higher dimension, a higher plane than the one that we're in today. So physical reality is very different than that world. In that world, reality is not comparable to anything that's here, but existence is more real than anything that's here. Does that make sense?
Yes.
So it's very difficult to explain with words, the Imams from the Ahl Bayt alayhim salam have said, because there are no words in our human vocabulary that can properly describe what it's like to exist in the soul world. We get a small, slight idea through the experiences that we have in the dream world, but it's still not like it is in the soul world. Abdullah Hashem said that you can almost hear over there, but yet not hear. This human experience of hearing through your physical ears, there is a different way over there whereby they can experience reality, but it's not the same as hearing over here. They can almost see, they can almost touch, but it's a different. There's something that's close to touching, close to seeing, close to hearing that they experience over there, but it's much greater, right, than the experience that we have here, and it's more real. In fact, when people go to that world, afterlife, they recognize instantly that this world here was but a play, it was but a show, it was something that was but an illusion, a mirage, something that was not real. For them, when they wake up in the soul world, it's like almost like they woke up from a dream, right? This was the dream that they were experiencing here. So it's the same thing. So the comparison, right, of the soul world and the physical world is like the comparison between the dream world and the wakeful world here. When we're in the dream, we think the dream is reality, right? Mm-hmm. But when we wake up from the dream, we think, oh my goodness, it was just a dream. And we think, how fake was that existence in comparison to this, what we're in right now? Yes. The same thing. The wakeful life is the soul world, and the dreaming life is this physical world that we're in here today.
Makes sense.
Does that make sense?
Yes.
Yeah. But, so long as we are dreaming, we want to hold on to that dream because, we're not sure what's going to happen. When you're in the dream, you forget about the waking life, right? Mm-hmm. Every night when you're asleep and you have a dream, in your dream, you think that that's reality. You're not thinking like, oh, if I wake up and you remember all your family members and your friends and your work scenarios and everything else that's going on, in your physical world, you forget all that when you're in the dream. As such, when we're in this physical world, the soul forgets about all of the pleasures and beauty and the reality and the importance of that world that we came from, that we also will return to. Okay? Yes. The soul is constantly striving to get close to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That is why it is tested in the soul world. God wishes to answer for the souls that question which it poses to itself, which is which of us is the best. Why does this soul get that and I do not get that? Why is this soul close and I am not close to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? Because in that world, God has souls and angels that are close angels, right? There are narrations that state very explicitly that there are some angels that are closer to God, right? Or exist under the throne of God or around. There's these 24 elders that are around the throne of God, right? Or there's these 8 carriers, angels that carry the throne of God, right? So we have these differing ranks when it comes to angels and righteous souls, and we know that we have this realm of paradise, this realm that these souls live in, and it has ranks in there. There's a first level, there's a second level, and it goes all the way up to a 7th level. So there are these ranking systems. There's these privileges that are given to souls that are greater or closer to God that are not given to every other soul, right? Not all the souls in the soul world, or in the hereafter, or in that world that preceded this world, not all those souls are at the same rank or the same level. And so Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, in his justice and fairness, he tests these souls, not because he doesn't know which one of them is better than the other, but rather so that he may establish a proof over them, and that none of them may use the argument against God that if only I was given the chance, right, I could have been the close one, or why are you preferring this son of yours, or this angel of yours, or this creation of yours over me? What did he do that was better than what I did? And in order that God may shut down that argument, what does he do? He makes these tests, right? He provides these opportunities for all of the righteous souls, all the souls actually, righteous or unrighteous, to display in front of everybody, and especially to its own self, how much faith it has. Thus, it answers to itself the question that it initially posed, which is, okay, that's why this person is closer and I'm not closer. Why are those people having privileges that I don't have? God, in his mercy, he repeats those tests because, the souls say, oh, but my condition was different, or he had this opportunity or that opportunity. And God, or give me a second chance. If you gave me only a second chance or gave me a third chance, I would do better. And so God provides many chances. And that is part of the reason why we incarnate into this physical world. It is a test that the souls wished to engage in, and the test basically consists of, if we were veiled behind the veils, meaning the human bodies, right? Which of us would still recognize God as he is veiled from behind a human body, right? Mm-hmm. So the first test in the soul world, we were all the souls were around and in the presence of the glory of God, right? Adam and Eve, it's written in the Torah that they walked with God in the garden, right? And there's many narrations that state that God was amongst the souls and the angels and creation in the soul world. Well, the test here is that we still recognize God without seeing the light of God. We recognize him through his voice. We recognize him through the essence of his nature. We recognize him through the substance of his soul, right? Rather than his physical manifestation. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. It makes perfect sense.
So Al-Hafid Sharif speaks about it. And it speaks about how the souls come into this world, and also the Spirit of God comes into this world. And the Spirit of God will veil himself behind a human being, right? Like in the Quran, when God blew into Adam from his spirit. So the Spirit of God is in a human being in every day and age. And the souls are coming into this test and they're going out of the test. And the Spirit of God is constantly, right? Whether he's in the body of Adam, or he's in the body of Abel, or he's in the body of Seth, or he's in the body of Moses, or Aaron, or Joshua, or Muhammad, or Ali, or Jesus, or Simon Peter, or whoever it is. He's constantly calling towards that which is good and calling towards the supremacy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And it is upon the souls who are now also veiled behind human bodies, and they don't know who is their enemy from the human beings and who is their friend or their ally. And there's all these different voices that are pulling them in different directions, right? Mm-hmm. And so the test is that in the midst of all these voices, in the midst of this great test, in the midst of being veiled, that they recognize the spirit or the soul of God, right? The Spirit of God.
Yes.
And whoever does so is like those whom, prostrated to God, or those who were the first to jump into the fire. Mm-hmm. And this experience that we have, that souls have in this physical world, it doesn't just happen once, but rather it happens many times, right? So that we have sufficient opportunity over the course of many different incarnations to achieve success in the mission that we have at hand. So we can incarnate, maybe we'll incarnate once as a man from China, and another time as a child in Africa, and another time, we incarnate as an Arab, in the time of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. But each soul in the end, right, has had enough incarnations to be able to discern the truth and to come into contact with the truth. Enough of an opportunity, right, to recognize God and have a fair chance at passing the test. And their initial placement, the initial placement of the soul into this physical world is based on how well they did in the test that was in the soul world. Mm-hmm. So, for example, all those who first threw themselves in the fire, all those who first recognized God in the soul world, they come down to this world and they're chosen as prophets and messengers and vicegerents of God, because they were so fast in recognizing God in that world that when they come into this physical world, they are, appropriate choice for God, and they're deserving, right, to be chosen as messengers. So then those people that say, why were those particular individuals chosen as prophets and messengers? Well, the reason is just, right? And God has an answer for that, and that's because there was this test that preceded the physical realm, and that was the test that we were in the soul world, and the people who did the best in that exam were, placed as prophets and messengers in this world. That doesn't mean that they're out of the test. In fact, the test of a prophet or messenger is much harder, because they must believe in their own self, right? And that's more difficult than than believing in somebody else, to be honest with you, because the messenger or the prophet knows his own inadequacies and their own faults, and they don't see themselves as, and they have to have yaqeen and certitude that the message that's coming down upon them from Gabriel is coming down from an angel, not coming down from a demon. It's really from God, or that God is going to, enforce them. And that's why some of these messengers, even, they committed mistakes during the journey, and we spoke about that on the channel before. Okay, so now we have these souls that are incarnating, that come into this world, and they're experiencing several incarnations, right? And some of these souls, they seek worldly pleasures. They're not seeking God. They're seeking something other than God, right? And some of them are seeking God. Those souls that prostrated in the first world, the Adam world, in this world, they also eventually, after seeing the prophets and messengers do goodness, after seeing other believers follow the prophets and messengers, they decide to follow the prophets and messengers, just like after seeing the prophets and messengers and other believers jumping into the fire. They jumped in the fire. The same thing here. They're the souls of the believers. They eventually, over the course of several incarnations, recognize God and become true believers. The bad souls, however, right, the disbelieving souls from the Adam world, those souls, no matter what type of opportunity they're given in this physical world, they never seem to prostrate. They never seem to burn themselves in the fire of the Imam of the time. And they remain denying, seeking something else. Right? Chasing after worldly pleasures. And that's a sign for you and for everybody else who's out there on how you can distinguish whether or not somebody has a soul that was successful in the Adam world or somebody who had a soul that failed from the Adam world, is that interest that they have and their pursuit or their goal that they have in life. There are some people that their pursuits in life is only fame and fortune, right? Or worldly satisfactions or pleasures, right? Just to have a nice house, nice garden, to eat good food, to have intercourse with many people, right? They're chasing after carnal desires. Those are the goals, right? And the behavior of the disbelieving spirits. They have no interest in religion whatsoever. So they're just fighting against. They might be fighting against the messenger or the message itself. All right, just as they fought not to go into the fire, or they fought against prostrating to the imam of the time.
So their behavior in the atom world is reflected here in this world.
Yes. And that's the thing, because of the nature of their essence. So the essence of the person is his soul, right? And the nature of how the soul is, its very substance, right? Its very way of being is what affects, how it is. And so everybody that goes through the test in the soul world has the opportunity to change in the physical world, but yet we see that they always repeat their same stance that they had in the soul world before. Does that make sense?
It does. It does make sense.
So Muhammad, him, Jesus, Moses, their stance is one of faith and submission in the soul world. They repeat that here. They never change that stance. Okay? And that's because those souls, are from the light and are to the light, because they chose to increase themselves in light by jumping into the light of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, jumping into that great fire, right? And it's not a fire like our worldly fire or the fire of hellfire, but the fire of closeness to God, the fire of the Sakina, so to speak, the fire of the, of the light of God. And they chose to prostrate themselves and peer into the veil of God and bathe in his light, as to where other souls in the beginning, they chose not to. They were doubtful, right? And they chose to remain in the darkness, away from God. So that darkness now that chose to remain away from God in the soul world, when it comes into this physical world, it has to overcome all of this darkness in order to change its kind of its destiny, right, or its course. And they usually never do that. They always repeat the same thing that they have done before, and they seal their destiny. And so now we have narrations from the Ahl Bayt alayhim salam that speak about how these souls continuously come here, and each and every one of them, through a karmic system, takes also what it deserves. There are anytime there's a test, right, there's always results. Anytime you have people, souls interacting with one another in a physical matrix, all right, you have people that are doing good and bad to one another. You have debt that is incurring, all right, due to the actions of the different souls towards one another. And this debt must be, set off balance. Like, it has to be balanced out in the end. All the debt has to be settled. And one of the ways of settling the debt that occurs between souls and one another is and one of the great ways that God displays his justice, and ensures that before the souls go back to him in the soul world, that nobody owes anybody anything, is through making the souls abide in vehicles or incarnate into bodies that are appropriate for their actions. So there's this, now it's become this marketplace, right? The earth is this marketplace where people are going in and they have this currency, and their currency is their deeds, right? And even in dreams, and in the dream world, the interpretation of currency or money is good deeds. When you see a dream where you see yourself dealing with money, this is dealing in good deeds, right? Good deeds or bad deeds, it's basically deeds in general. And so when a person incarnates here, right, they accumulate these deeds, either good or bad, right? And based on the deeds or the currency that they accumulate, they can buy bodies to incarnate into. Isn't that incredible?
Yeah, it's extremely interesting.
It is interesting. So, for example, just to clarify further, if a person comes in here, a soul, and he does really good, and he's constantly, feeding the poor, and he's constantly taking care of orphans, and he's constantly giving everything that he has. It is only God's justice that these actions of good deeds be returned to him. So now he has this money which he invested, which now he's owed back, right? And so all this good, positive energy and good deeds that he gave out, right, he's going to receive it again. So he gets now, before he incarnates in his next incarnation, a series of bodies that are within the price limit of what his deeds can buy, and he can choose which of those bodies to incarnate into. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does.
Yeah. So he can therefore buy for himself a privileged hereafter, or a privileged next incarnation. Right? And that's why the prophets and the messengers, they always used to say and tell people that, treat people as you yourself would want to be treated. Because anything that you do, you will receive that in your next incarnation. Right? So if you do bad to people, well, those people are going to do bad to you. Right? If you steal from somebody, somebody's going to steal from you. You deceive somebody, somebody will deceive you. And yet when you offer a meal with somebody, there is no way that you will exit out of this physical world and return back to the soul world, meaning your incarnations will end, except that you will find somebody returning that meal, rather an even better meal, to you and sharing it with you in a time of need.
So it's extremely just, and that karmic debt that person creates will ultimately come back to him or her.
Exactly. And everybody, anything that's between any souls, is settled in the physical world before they return back. Because once people enter into this physical reality, they have to continue until they finish all of their incarnations before returning back. And this is something which Al-Hafid Sharif and other narrations from the Ahlul Bayt alayhim salam has clarified. So you come in this world, you incarnate, and you're either on a ladder or a road upwards towards elevation until you reach the highest degree of closeness that you can obtain and that you have previously attained in the soul world in the previous tests. Or you reach that lowest point of depravity and degeneration, and disbelief that you can reach over the course of many bad incarnations. And when you reach that lowest point or that highest point, then your incarnations are done. This soul is not capable of becoming any better. This soul is not capable of becoming any worse. And thus it is returned back to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and goes back to the soul world for its final judgment. The final judgment determines whether or not the soul is going to go to heaven or to hell. And in that final judgment, you are judged, according to all those sins that you committed against your own self and those sins that you committed against Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? But you are not judged for the sins that you have committed against, his creation, because all of the debt of the sins or the mistakes or the crimes that you committed against your fellow man or the fellow souls that were with you in this matrix is already settled before you exit out of the physical world. And the settlement of the debt comes through interactions between the souls in the physical world. So I mentioned to you, for example, if somebody shared with you a meal, then perhaps in the next incarnation, that same person returns back to you that meal, or the grandson or the great grandson of that child will return back or do you a favor that is the equivalent. He does to you as much goodness as you have done to them. So now these souls are settled; they're equal to one another. If somebody, for example, stole from you a certain amount of money, right, and they escaped or they ran away, perhaps they incarnate as a slave of yours, right, or as a worker of yours, and they have to work off that debt which they had previously stolen from you.
Oh, yeah,
you see?
Yeah.
So you'll come back like with that person as your master, due to sins that you had committed. The souls also, they only get bodies that are appropriate for the mission or the objective or the goal that they are seeking. So if somebody, their goal is only, for example, to eat and taste good food, and they just want to constantly eat all the time, this does not need a human body to achieve this goal. Somebody could basically incarnate as a pig, for example, and they can eat all that they want to, and they're feeling the same sensations of their stomach being filled, right. And they don't need a human body for that. So it's one of the justices it's from the justice of God that he only gives a soul that which is appropriate for what the soul is intending or wanting. In one of the versions of the Bhagavad Gita, there's this colored photo that show that people, incarnate in accordance and receive their next body in accordance to their behaviors, right? And in accordance to their consciousness level and what it is that they are pursuing. So a woman, for example, who just wants to be, a model that's appreciated for her beauty, and she just wants to pose naked and not do anything else in life. She poses for film or she poses for, magazines. This same woman could very easily incarnate as a beautiful tree or a beautiful flower, because that's all that she needs. She just wants to be appreciated, right? Well, the goal of being appreciated for your beauty can be done, right, without you having a human body. You don't need a human body for that, right? This is not what the purpose of human bodies are. The purpose of the human body is to pursue a higher spiritual existence and consciousness. A person who likes to kill, he might come back as a lion or a tiger or a bear, somebody who's constantly eating meat, right? Or somebody who, like I said previously, whose only concern is eating, they might incarnate back as a pig. So then these individuals, who are in these bodies might also, as they are in the body of a dog or a horse or a cow, right, eliminate their spiritual karmic debt that they have towards other souls through the providing of services such as milk or plowing the ground, etc.
Okay, that's very clear.
Is that clear?
Yes.
Yeah, or giving eggs in the sense of chickens, right? And the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam and the Ahlul Bayt alayhim salam, they explained and gave an interpretation to the verse of the Holy Quran where it said that, and there's not a creature that's on the earth, basically, when he was speaking about the different creatures and species of animals that exist, there's not a single one of those species that are out there except that they were nations like you, or that they're nations like you. And the Ahl Bayt alayhim salam interpreted this to mean that there are no creatures, there are no animals, there's no birds, there's no fish, there's no insects that crawl upon the face of the earth, except that inside of some of them are the souls of people who existed on this planet before as human beings. And so we have the incarnation of souls into plants, into animals, into human beings, and also into inanimate objects such as stones, right? Or metals that are on the ground. And there are many narrations also which speak about this existence, and perhaps there'd be a soul, for example, that lived in the time of one of the prophets and messengers, and they did not want to hear what the prophet or messenger had to say. They ignored him. They acted like they didn't see him. They never spoke out in support of him. And so this soul does not need then, since it incarnated once so close to the messenger and it denied him, it doesn't need now another human body, because no matter how many human bodies it receives after that incarnation, it will never recognize God. Imagine somebody, for example, like Judas Iscariot, or somebody who was a disbeliever who incarnated around Jesus Christ, and he sees the miracles that Jesus performs, and yet, he ends his life in disbelief, as if he had never seen those miracles. Right? Or a person whom hears the words of wisdom of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. He's present there. He's incarnating around him. He's living around him, and he hears these words, and yet he denies him and behaves as if he didn't hear him or see him. Well, this soul now, it's only appropriate for it to exist in the form of a rock, right, or a stone that cannot hear, nor see, nor speak, nor interact at all, because that's the type of existence that it wished for.
I just want to say, Aba Al-Sadiq, with your permission, that may God protect us from such a fate, and may He help us, inshallah.
Ameen. But I have to say that God, in His justice, He offered you something better than His protection, and that is an ability, a choice for you to protect yourself through your deeds and your actions from such a fate, right? So it's something that is in your hands. Imam Ahmad al-Hassan, he said that there is a cure for all things except for one. God placed on this planet different diseases, right? There's cancer, and there, without a shadow of a doubt, exists the cure for cancer. There's diabetes, and there exists the cure for diabetes. There's headaches, and there exists, right, plants that we extract from an aspirin, which makes the headaches go away. There's everything that is a disease. There is a cure for it, except for one thing, and that is the dirty heart. A heart which is dirty. There's no cure for that. And that's why it's important for us to never allow our hearts to get in that state of filth, where we thereby, drive our spirit into the different lower realms of existence, on the planet.
Yes.
And lead it to eventual torment in the hereafter. Yeah. Yeah, like the souls of those tyrants like Pharaoh and Nimrod and Hitler and all of them. By the way, one of the fascinating examples of reincarnation, and karmic justice from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala comes in the form of the story of Moses and Pharaoh. So there is this scene that is this part of the Torah, the Bible, the Old Hebrew Bible, that is criticized. Atheists attack God, and they attack religion when they highlight this particular story. And it's the story of the very end of the plagues, the final plague, before Pharaoh decides to allow the Israelites to go, where after having punished all of the Egyptians, not just Pharaoh and his army, but everybody for, for not allowing Moses and the Israelites to go forward, God finally strikes the firstborn of every Egyptian. And each and every one of them die. They go to bed that night and they wake up the next morning, and all of the firstborn of the Egyptians pass away. And these are all innocent children. And the atheists and the critics of religion say, well, how can this be a just God? This is a baby killer. He's killing innocent children, right? And in the apparent, you would think so, right? If you weren't aware of the karmic justice and how God is giving each soul what's appropriate for it. But when we pay a little bit closer attention, you'll find out that actually what God did to Pharaoh and the Israelites, it was only a generation before, before Moses was born, that the Pharaoh that preceded that Pharaoh, that was living in the time of Moses, the one before him, he had received a prophecy from his fortune tellers, from his astrologers, right? That he'd received a prophecy that there was going to be born a man from the Israelites who was going to end his kingship and his rule. And so in response to that, what did he do? He issued a decree that all of the Hebrew males shall be slaughtered. Right. And so what they did at that time is that they went forward and they collected all of the Hebrew babies, right, the boys, and they slaughtered them and they threw them into the Nile River. They caused them to drown in the Nile, right? And that's why, in order to escape this fate, right, in order that God may save Moses from this fate, he inspires Lucha, who was the mother of Moses, to place Moses in a basket and put him into the Nile River, because that's where the Egyptians were placing anyway all of the babies. They were just throwing them into the Nile and causing them to drown, and they were basically slaughtering some of them. And so she does the same. She places Moses in a basket, puts him down the river in hopes that they might not be, that he might be saved, and in obedience to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And then Moses grows up in the house of Pharaoh, and eventually he's chosen as a prophet, and he has to go back to Pharaoh and demand that his people are released. And then God punishes that next generation and that next Pharaoh with what? With the slaughtering of their sons, right? Some people who say that it is an injustice are assuming that those babies that were killed, right, by God as a punishment, the Egyptian babies, that they were sinless. But in fact, the reality is that all of those Egyptian babies that were born were the reincarnation of Pharaoh and his soldiers that existed a generation before, that were responsible for the death of those kids.
Oh, God is great.
Yeah. So the son of Pharaoh, the son of Ramses II, was actually the reincarnation of the father of Ramses II, who made the initial decree.
Right.
Okay?
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
It does. It does.
And the same thing plays out in nature. The Hefta Sharif speaks about how there might have been a dog that attacks a woman when she's walking down the street, and that's because he sees her walking with her new husband, or it might have been because she did something to that dog in a previous life, and so the dog's returning it back to her. Or you might have a criminal that killed somebody, and that somebody was also a bad person, and that bad person reincarnated as an animal, and that animal eventually kills the person whom had just killed him in that same lifetime before. Yeah, in that same life of the criminal,
Yes.
He kills somebody, and that person that he kills reincarnates as an animal and eliminates him, actually. So
Right.
within the same lifespan of the criminal, he kills and he's killed. And so that karmic debt is balanced out, right? Or it's the score is settled.
Sure.
There is a time that the ultimate karmic retribution takes place. The ultimate score settling, the day of judgment on earth. And that is the day of the Qaim, the day of the rise, right? The day of the retribution, reckoning. And that is the day of the emergence of the Qaim. And the narrations of the Ahl Bayt alayhi salam spoke very explicitly about that day. And they said that on that day, every self will exact revenge, right? Or take retribution, or settle the score for that which it is owed, right? And everybody will get what they deserve. It is on that day that the people who do good will get good, and the people who do bad will get bad, right? And it is the day of the Raja, the day where it's a day in the history that will never repeat itself. And it is a day where all of the righteous souls return back, and all of the evil souls return back. And they incarnate on the earth at one particular time. And they have a giant spiritual battle amongst themselves. There's a giant battle that takes place on the planet where all of the forces of good face off against all of the forces of evil. And any soul that was good, that was harmed by a bad soul, the good soul is given the opportunity during that incarnation to take revenge against the bad soul. The prophets and the messengers that were murdered by evil tyrants will have an opportunity on that day to take revenge from their killers. John the Baptist would be able to take revenge from King Herod, right? You have Jesus would be able to take revenge from Pontius Pilate. Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam will be able to take revenge from Abu Lahab and Abu Jahl, right? And Abu Sufyan. Al-Hussein would be able to take revenge from Muawiyah and Yazid, right? Abel will be able to take revenge from Cain, right? So everybody that is owed something will be able to take revenge for that which it is owed on that day. Okay?
Aba Al-Sadiq, is it possible, with your permission, that we already are starting to see the beginning of that battle in the world today?
Oh, for sure. Yeah, this is the time of this is that day that we were speaking about. This is the day of the return. This is the day of the rise of the Qaim in this time period, even though the rise actually has already begun. And Abdullah Hashem, he said it. He said that you know, there's two phases to the rise, and the first phase of the rise we're already living right now, and we're experiencing it. And it's this phase of the return and the gathering of all of these souls, these ancient souls that all originate from the light.
Yes.
And these souls, when they come into this world, now they're in this particular incarnation, they're coming into this incarnation and in this world in order that they may achieve revenge, right? So it's kind of like they're in a privileged position, because now it's Judgment Day, actually, for the souls. So they're in a test, but they're not in a test. The people are in a test, but they're not in a test. In the sense of what? In the sense that now, and I want you to pay close attention to this because this is a complex issue.
Yes.
Now, those souls are not in a test of the best, but the human bodies are. The human selves are.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yes.
So, what I mean by that is that the souls of the prophets and the messengers are returning, right? And the souls of the evil tyrants are returning, right?
Yes.
the soul of Pharaoh and Nimrod, when they enter into two people, or they're incarnated, or they're born into this world, or they return into this world, Pharaoh, Nimrod, Cain, etc., in their new bodies, they have an opportunity, right, to commit good if they want to. Because it would be unjust from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to condemn the physical container or physical body of that soul to eternal damnation or to any form of punishment on this earth if it didn't commit it. Right?
Yes.
So there's a self, there's an identity, there's a soul, there's a body. These are different aspects that collectively make together a human experience on the earth. This goes for the good, this goes for the bad. The righteous souls also of the prophets and the messengers, they incarnate on this world, right? Yes. In a particular individual. In order that God may be just, the body, the vehicle, the self that is now a container for that soul also has a choice for it to make. And the choice is between obeying the will of the soul and submitting itself to that and doing good and listening to that divine inspiration of light, or rebelling against that soul. Does that make sense?
Yes.
It's very complex. Abdullah Hashem had said, and we explained it in The Call of the Wise, and we went over this partially in some of the episodes. The soul is not the animating force of a body initially. Okay?
Okay.
A physical body that exists has something which is called a self. The self, based on its inclination, based on whether or not it's a good self or a bad self, pursues either good or evil. Okay?
Okay.
When a soul comes down into that body, the self can only be inspired by that soul, but it has to submit itself to the soul in order for the soul to take control of the body.
Right. Yes.
Does that make sense?
Yes, I think Bhagavad Gita speaks about it also. There's the famous picture of Krishna in a chariot.
Exactly. It's exactly like that.
Yeah.
The chariot is the body of the human being. And the body of the human being is being led. It's being driven by these horses. And if you zoom in here and you look at these symbols that are around the horses, what will you find? You'll find one of them is a nose, one of them is an eye, one of them is an ear, etc. So these horses are actually the human senses. The human senses are what's driving the chariot, okay? And you have sitting, holding the reins of the chariot, this blinded individual, right? This is the self. Right. He's blind. He's depending on the information that he gets from the senses, those horses. He's sitting there as a driver, right? But in reality, the thing which is driving the body or the chariot is the senses, right? So the self is being driven by the senses of the body, and then you have sitting in the back of the chariot, right, the soul. The soul needs to take reins of the chariot itself. It has to take control of the body. But the only way that it can do so is if the self steps aside or allows for the soul to take reign or control of the chariot. So you have Buddha, Krishna, Arjuna, Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, Alexander, Confucius, Lao Tzu, Moses, Jesus, Muhammad, the Imams from the Ahl Bayt alayhim salam, all these righteous souls incarnating and descending into various chariots that are on the battlefield now. This final epic battlefield in the day of the Raja. Okay?
Yes.
They're all sitting in there.
Mm-hmm.
And each and every one of these souls descends upon these particular chariots because these particular physical bodies, right, and selves were pure enough to receive such great souls upon them. Mm-hmm. And now it becomes a phase where these righteous souls are trying to gain control of the chariot. Some of them will succeed in taking control of the chariot, and some of them will not. In the event that a soul takes control of its chariot, what will happen? What will happen is that it will fulfill what it needed to fulfill in this incarnation, and it will pass. It will succeed. It will have supported the Qaim and supported the Mahdi and succeeded in establishing a divine just state. Yes. And taking revenge from the non-believing souls and demons and devils, that incarnated here, and it would have went on after that to return to God and enter into paradise. But in the case of the souls that descend in the chariots, the good souls that descend into these chariots, mm-hmm. and then the self doubts and doesn't allow that soul to take control over the reign of the chariot, mm-hmm. and that self chooses instead to listen to the senses, right, mm-hmm. and go astray rather than submit to the soul that descended upon it, well, then what happens in that type of a scenario? Does the failure of the body, of the chariot now is riding into destruction. Right. It's on its way to rush over the cliff. It's rushing into the fire, right? Is it going to take the soul with it? The soul of this righteous prophet or messenger? That doesn't make sense, because that soul was a soul of goodness. It already lived all of these incarnations and passed and succeeded in being a prophet of God, right? So how can that prophet of God now go into hellfire? It doesn't happen. So what happens is this concept of transmigration, where the soul leaves the chariot and jumps off before the chariot reaches destruction, and the soul goes into a new chariot.
New body.
A new body. And we have an entire episode where we spoke about the transmigration of the soul, and we also talked about it in the book The Goal of the Wise, and we spoke about how Jesus at the scene of the crucifixion, he transmigrated into several bodies, and there are Gnostic texts which spoke about that. We also spoke about how the fact of the idea of the transmigration of the soul was one that the Jews were familiar with, and actually some of them expected that the soul of John the Baptist had transmigrated to Jesus after John's death, and there was only 6 months in between the ages of John the Baptist and Jesus. And so for them, when they asked him, are you the coming of John, right? Are you the return of John the Baptist? And then they obviously didn't mean that John the Baptist reincarnated as a baby into Jesus, because John was only born 6 months before Jesus. So they were around the same age. Anyway, there was only 6 months between them. So they expected that, and they were familiar with this notion that a soul can leave one chariot or one vehicle, and they can enter into another vehicle. Right. And that's an important topic, and that's an important matter to distinguish. So we have now a difference in these souls and these categories of souls. We have these souls now that have passed and they succeeded in their test in the Adam world, and they succeeded, or in the soul world, and they succeeded in their incarnations in this physical human world to such an extent that now they have become protected from fire, protected from hellfire, protected from failure or failing. And you have the vast majority of souls that are kind of like still in the test. They haven't reached like a place of full belief where now they're protected and they earned going into heaven, nor have they earned hellfire. And you have souls that have done such horrible bad things that no matter what it is that they do, they are always going to go to hellfire, like the souls of Hitler, for example, or the souls of Nimrod or Pharaoh or Abu Lahab or Abu Jahl, or these guys that are already condemned, for example, in the Quran, and a whole surah came down saying that, Abu Lahab's going to hellfire. This guy, he can't go now to paradise. It's not possible. Do you understand?
Yes.
But what is possible is that the chariot that Abu Lahab goes into decides not to obey this evil soul of Abu Lahab, thereby banishing it from inside of it. Do you understand?
Okay.
And receiving instead of it perhaps a good soul. And it is possible for the chariot to disobey the good soul that comes upon it, and thus it will banish the good soul from it, or the good soul would leave from it, and in exchange an evil soul will enter into it.
Right. SubhanAllah. Yeah, it's like with the King Saul in the Bible, for example.
Exactly, like King Saul in the Bible. Here was King Saul. He was appointed by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He was appointed by God. And the old Hebrew Bible says that the Spirit of God was upon Saul. So here he was a chariot for the Spirit of God. The Spirit of God, this soul, this righteous soul, enters into Saul. And he's operating Saul. At some point, Saul, his ego, his disobedience, his refusal to obey God and obey Samuel, right, causes him to make decisions that effectively cause the spirit that was in him to leave him and now go to David. Okay?
Yes.
And it says in the Hebrew Bible that an evil spirit tormented Saul instead, right? So the good spirit, the Spirit of God that was in Saul, left, and in exchange a demon entered into his chariot. The same thing happens in this day and age with souls. A person could be with a Qaim, and it happens many a times, and the narrations are very clear about it, and they're sifted, they're tested, and they apostate. Until even some narrations say that the closest of close ones to him become those with the most enmity towards him. And other narrations state that with the Qaim are Al-Miqdad and Abu Dar and the 7 sleepers and these prophets and messengers. So if these messengers are returning and they're with the Qaim in one narration, and in another narration, the closest of close ones of them are becoming the ones with the most enmity towards him, what does this mean? That those prophets and messengers become enemies of one another, or become enemies of the Qaim? No, absolutely not. What it means is that those individuals, those chariots, those vehicles, those people in this day and age that had within them the souls of the prophets and the messengers lost them due to their evil deeds or refusal to submit, just like in the time of Saul. And so then they become replaced. The spirit that was once in Saul goes to David. As such, in this time, the spirits of those companions of the Qaim that turn on him end up going to new vehicles or new individuals.
Understood.
Is that clear?
Yes.
And it is possible, too, that a soul incarnate into more than one vehicle at the same time, or in more than one chariot, or more than one body simultaneously. And that's one of the amazing things of the soul. But it's not something that should make us wonder or really like be too shocked, because we know that this is one of the abilities of Satan that he's given. And Satan is a very evil soul. Satan has the ability to be in multiple people at the same time and run through their veins, right? And as such, the good souls have the ability, if they want to incarnate in multiple bodies at the same time. Mm-hmm. And that's one of the fascinating matters that people don't know a whole lot about. Yes. Concerning the soul. Yes, so you might have like two people that are have the incarnation of David, or two people that have the incarnation of Habakkuk, or two people that have the incarnation of this person or that person.
It's fascinating indeed.
Yeah. It is fascinating, and it's not something that should make us wonder or be shocked about. And there are narrations from the Ahl Bayt alayhim salam that say things such as two friends are one soul that's split upon two different bodies. And this is also a quote that Aristotle and Socrates and Plato they spoke about as well. And and then you can the knowledge of the soul is one of those heavy knowledges. Mm-hmm. It's one of those heavy sciences that is really it's a fascinating topic, and questions are born every time a new matter is posed. All right. So if we speak, for example, about a soul incarnating into two chariots at the same time, then the question rises as to what are the rights of each one of those chariots upon the other, mm-hmm. right? If effectively you have two human beings that have one soul, are they the same individual or not? What is the right of each one of them over the other? Does one person's property mm-hmm. become the property of the other? What if one of them takes money without the other's knowledge? Is he held accountable for theft, right? Or not? Because essentially he's taking money from his own self, right? What if he kills his own self? Is he held accountable for murder? These are all very important questions. Sure. There are terrifying questions that come out of this. And it's all part of the jurisprudence of the soul. Is the wife of one of them halal for the other one of them? I mean, it's a very odd question, and it makes people initially feel a sense of disgust, right? But if you think about it, it's a reasonable question. Mm-hmm. It's an important question. And essentially what it is that we are asking is there a difference? Who has the rights? Is it the body that has the rights, or is it the soul that has the greater rights? Yeah. And what are those rights? And to what extent does those rights stretch out to?
So all very interesting questions.
It is very interesting questions. And inshallah, we can, and with time, the matter of the soul and the jurisprudence actually of the soul world and the souls and their relations with one another will all be, we'll speak about it and we'll reveal it in great detail. But I do want to draw your attention to the fact that in the time of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, there was a time period where the believers had cut off ties with their physical family members, mm-hmm. and they were assigned brothers. And it was the believing brother who would inherit from his believing brother.
Right.
Right? So the jurisprudence of the law states that when a family member passes away, if he didn't specify something in a will, right, that his property should go to X, Y, or Z, that automatically that individual, the deceased person's property, is divided in a particular way amongst his physical kin or family members. But there was a time in the life of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam that it was not the physical family of a believer that would inherit from him, because at the time, the physical family members of most of the believers were non-believers, were in a state of war too against the Prophet Muhammad.
Right.
And so the ones who would inherit would be who? Would be the believers that they were paired up with. The Prophet pairs, Salman and Abu Dharr, for example, with each other. He paired himself with Ali ibn Abi Talib. So each person would inherit from their brother. And there's narrations that state that in the time of the Qaim, there is this sign of signs that you shall know him by or recognize him by. And that is that in his time, the believer will inherit from his brother in the soul world, not his brother in the physical world. And so the Qaim rearranges families based on relations in the soul world and not in the physical world, and he brings forward a jurisprudence of the soul world. And so he makes that believers inherit from one another based on their relation in the soul world and not the physical world. So a person who would die, it would be his brother who would take over his property in the soul world, his soul brother, rather than his physical brother.
So that's his real brother.
His real brother. And perhaps he pairs people and marries them to their soulmate, who they were married to in the Adam world, who was created for him, rather than, being married to people that they're not appropriate for one another, right?
Sure.
And then there comes questions of soul sons and daughters and fathers and mothers and the interactions between all of them. And would a soul, somebody who's because if the physical bodies have sons and daughters and fathers and mothers and grandfathers and grandmothers and aunts and uncles, do the souls have also? If there are soul brothers, aren't there soul sisters and soul daughters and soul mothers and soul fathers? And if there was, which there is, then what is the jurisprudence? What does the divine law state about the nature of their interactions with one another? If I am in this physical world, right? If I'm in this physical world, mihram on my mother or my father, right? Like my mom does not have to, there's no restrictions in how she can interact with me. She can hug me, she can kiss me. In Islam, she would have been able to sit with me without a hijab on, etc., right?
Yes.
And the same goes for a sister. Well, what about my soul sister? Or what about my soul mother? Even though physically she's not related to me, if somebody had within them my soul sister, right, the soul of my sister, what would that make permissible in terms of the relationship between her and I?
Surely the rights and duties would be even greater.
Exactly. And that's the fascinating part. That's one of those heavy things that come in the Seventh Covenant or in the Sharia, or the jurisprudence of the Qaim, that because people are not used to that. And people feel insecure by that. And people feel a sense of disgust even by that, something which turns their hearts away. Like, how do I know that that's the case? How do I know he's not lying to me? Like, what does that mean? How can I now all of a sudden be mahram on somebody who's not even related to me? This is something which is new. This is something which is different. But actually, it's not new. It's something which happened in the time of the Prophet Muhammad regarding inheritance. And so it's just completed and implemented to its fullest extent in the time of the Mahdi or the Qaim from the family of Muhammad.
Alhamdulillah.
So now we talked about soul relations, and we talked about We talked about souls existing in multiple bodies at the same time, and we talked about people losing their soul even while they're alive and it going to somebody else, and we spoke about that in great detail. I guess we'll kind of go over this last piece of information. There's so much that we could say about the soul world. We could talk for days, but I don't want to make you tired, and I also don't want to overburden the viewers that are watching this episode. So we'll wrap it up on this last point, and then inshallah in a future episode we can see what the questions are from our audience, and perhaps go into other topics or make new episodes that are pertaining to other aspects of the soul. There is this aspect of soul incarnations and how that works, and it has to do with a misconception that people have about the very nature of reincarnations. So we know that people have traditionally believed that a person can incarnate into this world, right, and live a life, and then die, and then that same soul enter into a new body, right, 1,000 years later, or however many years later, or sometimes even instantly right afterwards, they enter into a new life, and now they enter into a third life after that, right? And then when we speak about the previous incarnations of an individual, we would be referring to the totality, right, of the number of times that soul entered into this world and lived out its life. So, for example, if we have, let's say, as an example, let's say that the Prophet Jacob, for example, he was born, he lived his life as Prophet Jacob, and then he passed away. And then he returned back again in the time of Imam Al-Sadiq as Al-Mufaddal ibn Umar. And then he passes away. And then he returns back in this day and age as one of the companions of the Qaim. Mm-hmm. Now, this individual who's a companion of the Qaim, we can say that he incarnated as Mufaddal ibn Umar, and he also incarnated as Jacob. And that's because that soul lived those two lives and then incarnated as him, right? Sure. And we know from the narrations of the Ahlul Bayt alayhim salam that the prophets and the messengers would incarnate always with the imams. Not all of them would incarnate with every imam, but that the different prophets and messengers were incarnating constantly with the imams and the hujjas. Jesus was an imam, and Jesus in his time, during the scene of the transfiguration of Christ, what happens? His disciples witness Moses and Elijah in the spirit world. They're there as disciples of Jesus. As such, during the times of the Imams, we have narrations where Imam Al-Sadiq would gather his closest companions. They would be sitting in a circle around him, and he would walk by and he would say, "Peace be upon you, O Jonah. Peace be upon you, O Abraham," right? Mm-hmm. And he would inform them of their incarnations or recognize them by their incarnations. Right. So that is one way that the soul reincarnates, by being born, dying, being born, dying, being born, dying. But there are other ways whereby souls can enter into a person, and the person can have multiple incarnations in the past, but it happens in a different way. Mm-hmm. And that is through the combination of two souls that are previously unrelated to one another.
Okay.
Yeah. So, for example, we have in the book The Goal of the Wise a Jewish narration or tradition which spoke about how Joseph, one night before achieving a state of perfection, he goes to sleep, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala fixes his matter in one night. Just like we have the narration that says that for the Mahdi, God fixes his matter in one night, right? So Joseph, the narration states, he goes to sleep, and while he's sleeping, the spirit of Enoch comes upon him. And then he wakes up and he has all this knowledge and ability to speak languages, and he understands hadiths and all of these things, right? So he becomes an enlightened spirit, but he already had in him the spirit of Joseph, and now the spirit of Enoch comes upon him. So now inside of him is both the spirit of Enoch and the spirit of Joseph. They combine together to become a soul that was more powerful than the soul of just Joseph alone.
Wow.
Do you understand?
Yes.
And it is right now that this soul can be said that it did have the incarnation of Enoch, and it incarnated as Enoch, and it incarnated as Joseph.
Too.
Even though it wasn't Enoch born into a chariot, died, and then came in and was born as Joseph, right? But rather it came upon Joseph and merged itself with the soul of Joseph. So this concept of the merging of souls together is a very alien concept and a foreign one to most human beings, but it's one that is present in religion, and it's one that is very important. And it's one that's scary too, because people then ask, well, what does that mean? That means that my soul, for example, the soul of Uri, after my death, like it can merge with another soul. Or even right now, during my life, I could go to sleep and another soul would merge with me. What does that mean? And then who is my soulmate? The soulmate of Uri, or the soulmate of this new soul that came upon me and merged with my soul? And then it becomes this other science. And then can the souls that have now merged separate once again after they have merged, or do they forever remain in a state of emergence, right? Emergence.
And I can imagine that this would be a very complex jurisprudence to kind of lay out.
It is a very complex one, yeah. But in short, it does exist. The notion of two souls entering into the same chariot, just like it could be one soul that's split upon two chariots, the opposite is possible, and that is that two souls can enter into one chariot. And they can remain separate from each other without merging in the same chariot. That is possible, and it's happened. And right now, it's only the case with two beings in the entire universe, that those souls are inside the same chariot without merging. They're separate from one another. They're not mixing with each other. They're in the chariot, but they're not mixing. And it's also possible that two souls enter into a chariot and they fully mix with one another until you can no longer separate the two. They forever remain mixed.
It's interesting.
It is very interesting. In the case of those two that entered into the chariot and they didn't mix, it is very possible that afterwards, after that life of the individual, or even during the life of the individual, that one of those souls leave. So it would be like the soul of Prophet Jacob and the soul of Prophet Moses. They could technically enter into a body, share that body without mixing with one another for a particular time period, and then the soul of Moses goes out afterwards and incarnates into somebody else, and this other soul also goes out and incarnates into somebody else. And in the other example where the souls merge together, that soul now that is merged, that's a combination of the two of them, after that incarnation, that soul will continue to move on in its mixed form.
So it's kind of like a new soul that was born.
That's exactly correct. In that case, it would be a new soul, a stronger soul, a soul now that is more powerful, like in the example of Joseph and Enoch. The combination soul of Joseph and Enoch is more powerful than the soul of Joseph alone. And the soul of Joseph and Enoch is now more powerful than the soul of Enoch. Okay?
Makes sense, yeah.
So the question remains, well, what happens to the soul or the identity of Enoch or Joseph? And that's where it's a very complex matter. You're right. The soul has the ability, when incarnating into this world, to send forward parts of itself, but not itself in its entirety. If you think of it as somebody has a carton of orange juice, and he has 2 cups. The cups are the containers, they're the chariots, they're the physical human bodies. The orange juice is the soul. You could pour the orange juice inside one of those containers, or you could pour it upon both of those containers. So you could have one soul in one body or one soul in 2 bodies. You could later come and get another carton, but this time the carton is apple juice. And you can pour the apple juice into one of those cups that had orange juice in them. And now you have one cup that has orange juice and one cup that has a combination of orange juice and apple juice. Could you separate the apple juice from the orange juice once it's poured in?
No.
It's impossible, right?
Yes.
The same thing with the soul. So now the orange juice, which is Joseph, is mixed with the apple juice, which is Enoch. It cannot separate. But there still is apple juice and there still is orange juice in the cartons. So Enoch could still incarnate by pouring forth more of himself into another human vehicle in the future or at the same time. And the same thing with Joseph. The original soul hasn't poured its full self onto the earth, but only a part of it. And now a new soul is born out of that part that was poured out of it and mixed with the other. Is that complex? Is your head spinning?
No, I mean, it is complex, yes, but it's very interesting at the same time. I would like to hear more.
It is interesting.
Yeah.
That is it's all the mysteries of the soul world. And it scares people because people, they like a sense, they always like to own things and control things. And one of the things that they can never control is the soul. But rather it's the soul that the self has to submit to and allow for it to control you. You know, so it's kind of this opposite. And people get anxious and scared about what does this mean for its afterlife? And what part of me is really me and what part of me is not? And what part of me experiences the bliss of the afterlife? We want to be individuals, separate. We want to be our own entity. We don't want to be part of something else. We don't want to be mixed with something else. We don't want to merge with anything else. We want to be alone, independent. We want to be I.
That's true.
Anyway, inshallah, in the coming episodes, we'll talk about the soul and what happens when it goes into heaven and what's heaven like. And we'll talk about perhaps hell and what hell is like. And we will touch up upon the different other mysteries that are pertaining to the soul and shed more light on this topic, depending upon the comprehension of the people that we are speaking to and the feedback that we get, inshallah, after releasing this episode. All right. Thank you, Juraj.
Thank you, Father. It's been an honor.
God bless you. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam.